Hello and good afternoon. I heartily welcome you all to the second session of the Northeast and Western Writers' Meet. This session is interactive as well as for sharing views. Shri Pradeep Acharya ji will chair this session, and the subject for the discussion and sharing views is poetry dying? Kya kavita ka ant ho raha hai? And the writers discussants who will participate in this session are Shri Pranjit Borah ji in Assamia language, Darshini Dadawala ji in Gujarati language, Shri Premchand Singh ji in Manipuri, and Shri Namdev Tarachandani ji in Sindhi. As I informed earlier, Shri Pradeep Acharya ji will chair this session. At the outset, I request Pradeep Acharya ji to open this session. Pradeep Acharya ji is an eminent Assamese and English writer, critic, and prolific translator. He has translated a number of works from Assamese into English and vice versa. He has many well-known translations like Ancient Gongs, Pages Stained with Blood, and When Seas Meet, translated from Assamese, and Krishnang Kabir Kabita, an anthology of black poetry translated into Assamese, etc. Many of his articles and translated works have been published in reputed literary journals and magazines. He is retired professor from Cotton College, Guwahati. Welcome, Professor Pradeep Acharya.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. Is poetry dying is something that intrigues me. I haven't found any obit notices as yet, and it appears to be thriving the way I see it. If it is dying, at least it's not suffering from the now quite popular pandemic, COVID-19, because recently I have come across an anthology. I can show that to you. Poems from Pandemia. This is published from Ireland a few months back. And it covers poetry on the pandemic situation from Australia to India, from Czechoslovakia to Nigeria. So all poets figure there, including one poet from Guwahati who writes in English. Amlanjyoti Goswami, one of his poems has appeared there also. Anyway, after Auschwitz, it was Adorno who had said, after Auschwitz, writing poetry would be barbaric. If that is so, writing poetry would be equally, if not more barbaric after Gaza. What had happened there? A kind of genocide. And these are things that we had been unwittingly witness to. So, but poetry continues. We'll consider the perspectives later after I listen to the speakers. And then I'll have something to say as my concluding remarks. But I think poetry is surviving. Why? Because it gives us an enriched understanding of life. As long as life continues, whether it's just fear and mating in birds or human life, as even I understand it, as long as it continues, poetry will thrive. On that note, I thank the Sahitya Akademi for asking me, and I would now ask our speakers to continue. Maybe Pranjit will begin our proceedings.
Yeah. Thank you. So, with this approval, I invite first Dr. Pranjit Borah ji. Pranjit ji is a noted Assamia writer and has 30 published books to his credit, including novels, collections of poems, children literature, etc. He has commendable contribution to the field of translation also, and translated folk poetry, Japanese haikus, as well as many short stories by different prominent writers. His works have been published in different leading Assamese magazines, and his poems have been translated into different Indian languages. Currently, he is working as a professor in humanities in Krishnakant Handiki State Open University, Assam. Pranjit ji, I now request you to share your views.
Okay. So thank you very much, Honorable Chair, Professor Pradip Acharya, my teacher in Cotton College. So, and my French speakers from different languages from Gujarati, Manipuri, and Sindhi. So, I have prepared a write-up on this exciting topic that is poetry dying, and I want to read it out so that we may not miss something in between. So let me read out the write-up is poetry dying. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are.
Okay, okay. So let me start by quoting from Maram al-Masri, a reputed Syrian poet living in Paris. I want to quote two parts from her long poems. The title of the poem itself is Poems. It has 13 parts, and I want to quote from the first part. On the wall of the school playground, the word freedom was written in white chalk. On the wall of the school playground, the word freedom was written in white chalk by small children's fingertips. On the walls of history, freedom has penned their names with blood.
Oh.
On the walls of history, freedom has penned their names with blood. No one needs to be explained that this is what Syria has been passing through. The sense of loss is everywhere. There seems no consolation, nothing. It is simply awful. The pain and anguish evoked by the paradox in these lines I have just quoted gets further extended while we read the section quoted below. I will read it out, another section. She arrives naked to the mountains and plains in Syria. She arrives naked to the mountains and plains in Syria, and in the refugee camps, her feet sink in mud. Her hands crack from the cold, but she moves forward. She crosses her children clinging to her arms. They fall as she runs. She suffers and cries, but she moves forward. She breaks her leg, but she moves forward. They slit her throat, but she continues to sing. Tell me a story, said the boy, born in Syrian prison, to a mother who has been raped. Tell me a story, said the boy, born in Syrian prison, to a mother who has been raped. The image of the mother with her children clinging to her arms here immediately connects us with a world which is completely disenchanted. But this world starts endlessly haunting us as we reach the final lines with the raped mother who continues to sing amid all odds, and the boy born in Syrian prison urging her to tell him a story. Indeed, herein lies the ethos of poetry. The mother continuing her song amid all turbulences is none but poetry itself. This is then the image of poetry. It makes things happen. Whenever there is none to transmute, I am quoting from Octavio Paz, this particular word transmute. Whenever there is none to transmute history, it takes that responsibility. Poetry transmutes, And it does so by connecting with the mass, who of course may not be aware of what poetry is or what a poet means. Neruda must have sensed this power of connection in poetry when he spoke of a poetry of bread where everyone may eat. Octavio Paz wrote that the poet connects by means of his words. What makes us aware or sensible about our being are none but the words used by the poets. This is what has been termed as the symbolic function of poetry. At a time when the whole world has been under the grip of terror and violence arising out of so many sources, this symbolic function of poetry has assumed a new urgency. Amid endless sophistications and fashioned glittering, we still continue to be the inhabitants of a world where people die of poverty and famine. People commit suicide in their fields full of ripening grains. People die of war due to class, caste, race, gender, and religion, due to politics, due to the market, due to the blind law. They suffer due to their protests against the system. They suffer due to their voices against the state that has been supposed to be a construct of their participation in it. Poetry has long stood as the stern sentinel to all these shows of violence against humanity. The poet has long been faithfully engaged in becoming a witness to all this violence and terror. Anna Akhmatova, one of the most influential voices of the contemporary times, the Russian poet, may be seen to make her voice a potent record of her stern fate on this particular role of poetry. In the introduction to the cycle Requiem, which describes in penetrating detail the experiences of a generation of women in the queues outside Stalin's prison, Akhmatova echoes these lines and notes with pride the duty that she has taken on her soldiers. Quote, in the terrible years of Zhdanov terror, I spent 17 months waiting in line outside the prison in Leningrad. One day, somebody in the crowd identified. Standing behind me was a woman with lips blue from the cold, who had, of course, never heard me called by name before. Now, she started out of torpor common to us all and asked me in a whisper, can you describe this? And I said, I can. Unquote. Akhmatova's poem indeed faithfully records the violence of that Stalinist regime. Poetry has thus become solely instrumental in transmuting what has been voiceless and subdued during those hours of terror. In the Assamese scenario, Nilamani Fukon's, whose poetry came out to represent the fears, the whispers, the cries, the wounds, as well as the pains of millions of people, especially during the 80s of the last century, that turned all humanity and its attendant values to nothing, may be cited as another glaring instance or example. I want to quote a few lines from Nilamani Fukon's poem. Don't ask me how I have been. Don't ask me how I have been. I have not asked me either. Down the column flows a young female torso. What I was last night, king, hermit, father, king, hermit, farmer, labor, lover, rebel, poet, a tiger looking for water holes after the kill. I forgot what I was. This is a long poem, and this poem describes well the pains of the 80s of the last century where humanity suffered. In Homir Tati also, the diction may be seen faithfully projecting the ironies and paradoxes of the powerless, especially in the post-colonial scenery. Poets like Gyan Pujari, Seniram Gogoi, Anubhav Tuloki in Assamese, like Yamlam Ibomsa Singh, Sharat Chandra Chiam in Manipuri, like Sandrakantra Murashing in Kakborok, all of them have made poetry their medium to respond to the innate human desire to make this world human at the time of crisis and adversity. Even when a poet like Nilin Kumar engages himself in the art of defamiliarization, his ultimate objective is to make people aware of the layers beneath the seeming realities of their surroundings. Poetry in this way always lends an air to the hidden truth underlying beneath the commonplace. And this truth it discovers is all important. And this truth it discovers is all important. It may not be of any utilitarian value immediately, but gradually it is sure to become part of social consciousness. It would help redefining, revaluing, and reshaping the humanity at stake. Poetry is hence more than a formal game. The poet is more than a mathematician of words and punctuations. It is the art that transmutes. It is the sensitivity that keeps humanity alive by fighting the dehumanization. It is because of this power inherent within the poet and his poem that we again and again turn towards it and we celebrate it. How can it die? How can a Fayaz or a Hikmat die? How can a Lorca die? How can a Brecht die? How can Shankha Ghosh or Niren Chakrabarti or Samsul Rahman die? Poetry cannot die. It sustains to transmute history. It sustains to keep human sensitivity alive. It works in the sense that it is inclusive of all who knows it and who knows not. As the renowned Polish poet Tadeusz Różewicz utters, I am quoting from him, a poet is one who writes verses and one who doesn't write verses. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pranjit. You have
Pranjit.
quite a number of legions of poetry from Anna Akhmatova. And from that particular poem, Requiem, please allow me to quote one couplet. Husband killed, son in jail, say a prayer for my soul. That was the state that poets had been reduced to. But they resurrected themselves. Poetry resurrects itself always. Pranjit had also talked about freedom to start with. Now we find, because of the pandemic, each of us is in a separate prison of our own. That is what is happening. So we'll proceed next to.
Next, I invite Shri Pranjit ji, after Pranjit ji, Darshini Dadawala ji. Darshini ji is a noted Gujarati writer and critic. Currently, she is working as an associate professor, Department of Gujarati, MS University, Vadodara. Her works have been published in local, national, and international journals as well. Vivechan, a book by her, is focused on Gujarati criticism. She has been serving various academic and non-academic institutions, organizations, and the founder, president of Samviti Foundation. She is the recipient of travel grant scheme of Sahitya Akademi. Welcome, Darshini ji.
Thank you so much for a very warm welcome. I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, you are.
Namaste. Chair of this session, Shri Pradeep Acharya ji, esteemed co-panelists of this session, invited guests and dear friends. Very warm afternoon greetings from your friend from Gujarat, Darshana. I'm happy to meet you all. I also wish you and your family are fine and safe during this challenging time through which the entire mankind is trying to make a way forward. It is a matter of pride and pleasure to join all of us today for an interesting session titled Is Poetry Dying? I am thankful to Sahitya Akademi, Dr. K. Srinivas Rauji, and eminent poetry Vinod Joshiji for the invitation. I shall share my views on session's theme, Is Poetry Dying, for about 10 to 12 minutes. Is poetry dying? Theme leads me to three questions. First, is poem a living being? Second, does poem has a lifespan? Third, which are the factors leading us to raise this question? Now, the first question, is poem a living being? The theme of this session is a metaphorical expression about the existence of a poem, leading us to think in a particular direction. It suggests that poem exists just as we human beings exist. And therefore, we are visualizing about its dying or death. I am of the opinion that the existence of a poem differs from the existence of humans. However, we have to agree that both are alive. Humans take birth, they grow, and finally meet with an end called death. No matter how hard we try, we can't alter this process. Can we apply the same observation to poem? The answer is very clear. No. Poem is an experience taking place in the consciousness of the one who encounters it. It's a psychological cognitive process of coming to know, realize something, resulting into one's multi-layered and multidimensional felt experience, which leads us to feel the aesthetic pleasure or rasanubhav. The physical presence of words on a piece of paper may not be considered as its existence. It's just a method through which poem achieves its process of reaching out. Therefore, raising a question, is poem dying, can be responded by saying, as long as the human consciousness encounters poem for an experience, this particular question loses its relevance. Second question which I raised, does poem has a lifespan? This is an interesting question getting framed from the theme of this session. If we believe poem is a living being, it must have a lifespan and therefore we worry for its dying or death. But I have two observations to make here. First, poem does come to life at a particular time and on a particular day on a piece of paper. If we believe it to be its commencement point of physical existence, we may not be fully incorrect. However, as I have put forward in observation, that poem is a psychological experience taking place in the consciousness of a human being. It leads us to believe that after its physical birth, the existence of poem lasts till eternity. Second observation, poem doesn't cease to exist in my opinion. It never meets with an end, may be called a death. Poem makes a mark in the history of human civilizations. It creates its unique identity and position in the given culture. Just as the star keeps shining in the sky, poem keeps twinkling in the page of a book and hearts of people who have encountered it. So based on these two observations, I wish to free the existence of a poem from raising this question that does poem has a lifespan? I believe it would be unfair to reduce the existence of a poem to something which fits into a calendar and a clock. Now, the third question, which factors have led us to raise this question? Probably the question, though it mentions the word death, it is probably understood by the framers of this question not so much as literal death of poetry as decline of poetry as a form of literary art. So another question, if we are free to take the liberty of interpretation and rephrase this question as, is poetry declining? Then there are a lot of relevant points that emerge and seek our attention. When we say decline, the decline has to be measured through some yardsticks. So probably what we have in mind is the golden age of poetry, which is behind us now. We feel probably we will not be able to reach to that level of excellence and creativity in poetic art. So the regret, the complaint, the grievance, why are we not experiencing the same kind of creativity in poetic art has led us to frame this question. I am aware of the fact that answer to this question would be highly subjective and differs from language to language and culture to culture. So the question is, why are we facing this decline? The answer that comes to me is very subtle. I believe poem is always a product of social condition in general and individual emotion in particular. In a way, it is an outcome of something intensely felt. Now, the fact is, society has undergone a change to an extent that we hardly feel emotions. Even if we agree that we feel emotions, what is the depth, intensity, and quality of these emotions? In the absence of profound emotional experiences, I believe a need to articulate such experiences through poems has got compromised. I wish to share an example to sustain my argument. Breakup is such a common way of life nowadays. How can we imagine Devdas getting born in a society like us? Also, there are other forms of arts available for such expressions which receive wider and larger attention from the art lovers. And therefore, artists may choose to opt for such forms which may lead them for better reception. If we take the data from Google search, we shall understand that the people looking for poetry channels are less in number than people looking for, let's say, pop music or other forms of art. Technological advancement and social media presence has also changed our perspective of how we look at life and respond. It has certainly caused some dehumanizing and desensitizing effects on human experience. We hardly stay with emotions. We simply pass on to another. Also, they are plural in number. So being with an emotion and making an attempt to transform it into a piece of art calls for a more conducive environment to propel the poetic art. These two major advancements of the current century has impacted the art of poem to a great extent. People choose to feel the poem through performance than reading it. Just as we see stand-up comedy, we have entered the days of stand-up poem presentations. Has poem moved away from masses? This is my another point. We also need to reflect on this question. In medieval times, literature was present in the lives of people so effectively that it used to serve the purpose of education as well as entertainment. Bhakti movement of India is a classic example of this observation. Now there are other platforms available through which both the purposes get satisfied. So various choices have reduced the scope of poem in the society. Also, as a form of art, poem has undergone various transitions. These transitions have made it a more subtle art, but more complex to understand. Let's say, how many people will be easily able to follow modern or postmodern poem comparison of poem of Gandhian era? So the bond between the poem and society has underwent a great compromise, and that could also be a factor for us to reflect upon.
Excuse me, Darshini ji. Excuse me, you're not audible now. No, not yet. Why did it happen? Oh. Was that because of the network issue?
Perhaps, maybe she will join again, and then I think it will be okay.
Yeah. Just wait for a while.
Yeah.
Her wonderful flow was broken, though. She is trying to join again. Let me admit. Yes, Darshini ji.
Yeah, so am I audible now?
It's okay now.
I don't know, I'm sorry what went wrong. I'm sorry for the inconvenience.
That
So I'll
couldn't,
just pick up from where I left.
Please continue.
So, yeah, so we also have to take into consideration people's choice of reading fiction more than poems. Why have we entered into this trend? Needs proper research and critical analysis. So in conclusion, I wish to say that though poem enjoys eternal presence among the human beings, the very in day-to-day living has got challenges and questions to be answered. Therefore, we are forced to organize such sessions. I congratulate and compliment the organizers for such a wonderful effort of conducting a very relevant and meaningful session. I thank you one and all for pleasant hearing. I'm humbled and honored, and please do take care of yourselves. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Darshini. That was quite an interesting take on the sentiment, is poetry dying? She was bringing in existence, lifespan, etc., but finally ended with a kind of eternity, which is possible. After all, I haven't come across a dead man writing a poem. Poems are written by live human beings, and poetry is quite like life. It is organic. You cannot separate one word from the rest in order to understand the sentiment inherent in the poem. It's an organic growth. So we are not talking about lifespan in the biological, physiological sense, but more in the metaphorical sense. So in poetry, we find something, and we can go back to the roots of human civilization. If she has to talk about a lifespan, I would like her to measure the lifespan of Homer's Iliad. or the Mahabharata or Dante's Divine Comedy. After all, T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland quotes verbatim from the Divine Comedy Inferno. I believe it was Canto 3. I didn't know death had undone so many. So it continues. Poetry is written with words. Poems do not shoot guns. It doesn't kill either. It is something that incorporates life, gives life something beyond the allotted span, a kind of eternity. Thank you so much. Now I believe we can go over to the next speaker.
Yeah. Now let us invite Dr. Premchandra Singh ji, who is a noted Manipuri writer and with all his humility calls himself a student of literature and culture. An avid translator and has authored a book titled Hijan Hirao Text, Context and Translation. Currently, he teaches at the Department of English, Tripura University. Premchandra ji, welcome.
Thank you very much. Honorable Chair, Professor Pradip Acharya, fellow paper readers, as others have done, I'm also going to read out this write-up so that we save on time. I'm sorry that I'll be taking you towards a different direction. Am I audible?
Yeah, you are. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So it is quite common in the pedagogic world to make claims and counterclaims. Hence, it is no wonder that Michel Foucault pronounced the death of God. Francis Fukuyama announced the end of history. Jacques Derrida killed the author. Thankfully, no one has made any claim to have killed human language just yet. I'm making this simple statement because nothing seems to be possible without language, be it culture, civilization, literature, or even faith systems. But why this question? Why poetry is dying? Or is poetry dying? My take is that as long as there is language, there will be poetry, because poetry has always been at the forefront of literary activities ever since we human beings discovered the ability of spoken words to inspire human minds and instill happiness in human hearts. It means that literature began with poetry in the oral form, but it faces its most significant challenges in the digital age after dominating the entire literate era. Poetry will never die, but it is facing a crisis or a decline, as Darshana has put it. And today I will talk about the crisis or crisis in the plural form faced by poetry, particularly in Manipuri poetry. Others have spoken about their languages and their experiences and poetry in general. I will put forward 4 fundamental reasons, or rather challenges, I think are the causes for this crisis in Manipuri poetry. The first one is ontological. By that, I mean the changes taking place thematically and functionally in Manipuri poetry as the political situation in Manipur is evolving over the years. The second reason is attitudinal or behavioral. The third reason is the impact of language change on poetry, especially in Manipuri poetry. And finally, the process of production, consumption, and the transmission of poetry in Manipur, which I believe is an issue common to all the other regional languages in India. The first point is poetry and the political change in Manipur. Poetry in the modern Manipuri language can be divided into pre-war and post-war periods. The pre-war poets introduced modernity in literature, but it was the post-war poets who used poetry as a medium to express personal anguish over the deteriorating socio-political atmosphere in Manipur. Writing experience became the norm in the 70s and 80s. There was no issue which the Manipuri poets did not cover. Because of the violence permeating from the insurgency movement in the state in the 80s, Manipuri poets, or rather Manipur poetry, also took a violent turn. Our poetry highlighted the fears of loss and deprivation apart from anxiety for the loss of culture, traditions, identity, collective memory, etc. Because of the presence of violence in Manipur's socio-political setup, new socio-political dynamics entered into the everyday life of Manipuris. A creative space or of more significant new perspectives, thoughts was formed. With this movement, literature becomes more than a socio-political reality. Every Manipuri poem is injured. Every sentence bleeds blood. For over 4 decades, Manipuri poetry seemed to have stuck in some whirlpool of blood, violence, and anxiety. Now the question is, what happens when there is peace in the state and the violence is a thing of the past? Is it still on?
Yes.
Is it still on?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. For almost half a century, there is poetic monotony. There is a tone of frustration in Manipuri poetry. Nevertheless, the perception of violence and the loss of life due to the insurgency movement is beginning to change. Therefore, expressions associated with this violence must change too. This stagnation in Manipuri literature, especially poetry, only warrants this question. Is there a lack of inventiveness among the young generation of Manipuri poets? For all we know is that a tradition must come to an end for another one to begin. If so, what should be the new standards of poetic excellence in Manipuri literature? The second point is literature and human nature from the oral to the digital. Virginia Woolf once famously wrote, and I quote, "On or about December 1910, human nature changed," unquote. What she means by that is the focus of human beings which have shifted towards a new direction in art, human behavior, technology, values, and ideals. Advancements in science and technology and artificial intelligence in the later part of the 20th century have further changed how we think, behave, and communicate. As someone who teaches poetry in the classroom, this is the hardest part, making poetry interesting to the students. And this is also a challenge. Most of the poems which are taught in our classrooms are either British or American. Can our students relate to British or American ideals and worldviews? One may argue that human feelings are the same and try to pitch the universality of literature. But whatever one may say, a poem about the Brahmaputra River is closer to the mind and the heart than the Nile or the River Thames. So therefore, the question is poetry modern enough to appeal to the digital generation? Printed text replaced poetry that was on the lips and orally circulated. The digital format has now replaced the printed format. Therefore, we see the emergence of Insta poets who share their Insta poetry on Instagram and other social media platforms. Poetry written and shared on the microblogging sites can easily be accessed and read by millions. But they are accused of disgracing the fine craft of poetry and poetry writing. Closer home, I'm just giving an example. Some Mia poems have gone viral. Can you imagine poetry going viral in today's time? And many people are writing poetry on Facebook. The point here is that conventional poetry, which focuses on the literariness of the written words, is getting buried under the heap of pages and the poetry written for mass consumption are scrolled up and down on the move millions of times in a day. So it means that the nature of poetry is changing, and we must adapt to the changing times and the technology for its survival and sustenance. The second issue that we face in Manipuri poetry is the language issue, which I'm going to skip because we don't have much time. There are basically two different languages, the old classical language and the modern language, and how young generation are oblivious about the old, Manipuri, and they are allowing this inflow of new words and idioms and expressions. And also keep this thing in your mind that we have hardly 2.5 million speakers, Manipuris. And out of 2.5 million, we have 1 million or less than that speaking this particular language. We have 250 people speaking one language. Our languages are endangered, cannot be compared to other major languages like Hindi or Bangla or other languages. That's another issue. And also the script issue, which I'm going to skip. The fourth point which I would like to make here is on the production, transmission, and reception of Manipuri poetry. In Manipur, almost all poetry collections are self-published. People may accuse our poets of vanity publishing, but this is the fact. Almost all, 99%, are self-published. And the consumption is significantly less. It is customary for poets to meet and present their collections or rather anthologies at book publication ceremonies and other literary functions. For poetry to sustain, our whole approach to production, transmission, and consumption of literature must change. One may find thousands of ebooks in English, but hardly any such digital publications in any regional language. All in all, the literature in the vernacular languages of the region require a massive stimulus for its survival and sustenance. Furthermore, we have not developed models and tools carved out specially to interpret our text. The prolonged development of critical thought and articulation, or the near absence of critical writings, doesn't seem to bother anyone even today. It is therefore no wonder that many poets fill in as critics who evaluate the works of their contemporaries or predecessors. Regional literatures or literatures in the vernacular languages are yet to take center stage in a multicultural and multilingual country like India. It's such a cliche, but I'll have to use these terms. Multiple factors need to be addressed if we were to mainstream these literatures, and especially poetry. As obvious as it would sound, the first one is to mitigate the issue of the lack or absence of translations in major languages, especially in English and Hindi. Secondly, our approach to literature learning in colleges and universities must change to bring in more India-centric literatures in our classrooms, which are culturally and aesthetically closer to our hearts and ears. Thirdly, we must promote regional literature through seminars, conferences, and the literary festivals, of which this very platform is a textbook example. In conclusion, I want to say that poetry isn't dying unless we kill it. But there is definitely a crisis in poetry. We must act fast and act now before the problem turns into a disaster. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prem Chandra, that was a very complex response to the rhetorical question, is poetry dying? After all, you have ranged from the ontological to the epistemological, till you encounter the very palpable presence of violence that everyone and everything was immersed in Manipur, as we have witnessed. So I would like to ask you, where would you place a poet like Mamchodi, consequent upon the violence that you have talked about? I had met her and they are all my friends. For instance, the character obviously has changed from, say, Yamlimba Miboncha to Sarat Sansi and then Mamchodi and later. But what I am intrigued by is the take on the present of Manipur by the playwright Kanhayala and his creation of individual spaces. I believe that kind of individual spaces is an imperative for the present of Manipuri and regional poetry. Thank you so much. Now I believe we could move over to the next speaker,
Yeah.
Namdev.
Next speaker is Shri Namdev Tarachandani ji, who is basically a Sindhi poet and critic, but writes in Hindi and Gujarati with equal ease. He has 15 published books to his credit in Sindhi and Gujarati, including edited and translated works, besides several works in different anthologies. He has also published a few audio and e-books. He is the recipient of Sahitya Akademi Award, Senior Fellowship of Ministry of Culture, Government of India, Akhil Bharat Sindhi Boli and Sahitya Sabha Literary Award, Gujarat Gaurav Puraskar, etc. He retired as head Department of Hindi, Kapadia Mahila College, Bhavnagar University, Gujarat. Currently, Tarachandani ji convenes Sahitya Akademi's Sindhi Advisory Board. Welcome, Namdev ji.
Thank you, sir. प्रश्न के रूप में जो आई एम सॉरी नमस्कार टू एवरीवन आई वाज जस्ट इन हरी क्या कहते हैं कि लास्ट नंबर जो होता है ना वो उसको ज़्यादा जल्दी होती है, लोग भाग न जाए। यहाँ तो ऐसा प्रश्न नहीं उठता। प्रश्न के रूप में जो विषय हमारे सामने आया है उसमें तीन वक्ताओं ने जो कुछ कहा है, मेरा कहना उससे शायद थोड़ा अलग हो लेकिन ज़्यादा अलग नहीं है, क्योंकि डिक्लाइन और क्राइसिस तो सभी मानते हैं, मैं थोड़ा ज़्यादा मानता हूँ। मेरे इस वक्तव्य के 4 पॉइंट हैं: भूमिका, कारण, उपाय, उपसंहार। क्या कविता मर रही है? यह विषय यहाँ नहीं आया होता यदि उसमें कुछ न कुछ सच्चाई न होती। यह विषय डिकोड करेंगे तो वह खुल जाएगा और कहेगा कविता का अंत हो रहा है, उसे कैसे बचाया जाए। यह प्रश्न नहीं, एक पुकार है, चीख है, इट्स अ साइलेंट क्राई। कविता है क्या? जो गद्य के सीधे सादे रूप में नहीं कहा जा सकता, वह विशिष्ट शैली में व्यंजना के रूप में कविता में कहा जा सकता है। इसलिए सच कविता में फिर भी व्यक्त हो जाता है, जो हमारी कमजोर नस को दबा देता है। इसलिए प्राचीन भारतीय आचार्यों ने काव्य के कई सिद्धांत और संप्रदाय बनाए थे। मुझे उनमें कुंतक का वक्रोक्ति सिद्धांत विशेष सार्थक लगता है, जिसमें रस के साथ प्राय सभी सिद्धांतों का समाहार किया गया था। एक जमाने में छंद काव्य का पर्याय था, फिर अलंकार भी जैसे उसका पर्याय बन गया। स्वयं काव्य शब्द भी समग्र साहित्य का पर्याय रहा था। आज भाव और विचार उसका हार्द है। कैसा होगा वह युग जब योगियों जैसी प्रतिभा रखने वाले आचार्यों ने हजारों अलंकारों का आविष्कार किया था। एक अतिशोक्ति अलंकार भी होता है, लेकिन हजारों शब्द में अतिशोक्ति नहीं रखी मैंने। इट इज देयर। और आज हास्य कविता के नाम पर परिहास को कविता की आत्मा कहने वाले चाटुकारिता की कुशलता पर सेलिब्रिटी कवि बन जाते हैं। दोष उनका नहीं। हम हर बहते पानी को गंगा कहने वालों का है, जो कविता का हार्द व्यंजना में नहीं, प्रभाव में, ध्वनि प्रभाव में समझ बैठते हैं। हाँ, कविता दोनों स्तरों पर मर रही है। एक तो भावक की प्राथमिकताएं बदल गई हैं। दूसरा, कवियों में धैर्य, पेशेंस की कमी के कारण और स्पर्धात्मक शीघ्रता के कारण रचना कर्म सतही होता गया है। दोनों कारणों का कुछ विश्लेषण देखें। भावक के पास अब लिखित शब्द से अधिक प्रभावक और अधिक मात्रा में उच्चरित शब्द, स्पोकन वर्ड, और वह भी रंगारंगी दृश्यों के साथ भरपूर रूप में आ गया है। उसकी प्राथमिकताएं इतनी तो बदल गई है कि कविता पारंपरिक रूप व मुद्रा में तो कहीं खो सी गई है। कवि कर्म भी आज अन्य कलाविधियों के मुकाबले पीछे की बेंच पर बैठा है। भावक की मनोदशा, मनस्थिति के आगे शीलवान काव्य रचना के चाहक अत्यंत कम होते गए। वैसे ही संजीदा कवि भी दुर्लभ हो रहे हैं। कविता जाने पाठ्यक्रमों की चीज बन गई है। मधुर गीत हम पसंद करते हैं, पर उनकी शब्द रचना और रचनाकार से हमारा कोई मतलब ही नहीं होता। हम बिना समझे गुनगुनाने लगते हैं। अधिकांश मुशायरे और कवि सम्मेलन भी मनोरंजन के ऊपर निशावर हो जाते हैं, जैसे यह विचार का मंच नहीं, ग्लैमर और मनोरंजन का मंच है। संजीदा कविता का कहीं अतापता हो तो बताइए। यह तो हुई स्थिति और उसके कुछ कारण, पर कारण जानने से आगे क्या होगा? उपाय। कविता को अब भी स्वयं कविता ही बचा पाएगी। कलात्मक आनंद, एस्थेटिक प्लेजर का रसास्वादन कराने वाली, शोर कोलाहल से दूर, शांत चित्त, सितार की तान और सितारों के सामीप्य वाली अभिव्यक्ति की शीतल छाया की संवेदनाएं भरी कविता, जो समूह माध्यमों की मदद से हमारी रुचियों को परिष्कृत करे, ऐसी संजीवनी बन सके, वैसी कविता ही इस उदासीन भावभूमि को पुनः गुंजित कर सकती है। हाँ, बहुत मुश्किल है, पर आशा की किरण तो वहीं कहीं है। उसके लिए किसी बड़ी प्रेरणा शक्ति की आवश्यकता होगी। कोई कहीं से एक अदर कालिदास ढूंढ लाए तो कुछ बात बने। हाँ, उसे सोशल मीडिया से दूर नहीं रखना है, उसका दोष नहीं, वह तो माध्यम है। माध्यम में मधुरता के साथ सार्थक शब्द प्रयोगा जाए तो भावक वर्ग को भी दिशा मिलेगी, जो कहीं 50 शेड्स में खो गया है। सच यह भी है कि अति सुलभ विलासिता के चलते भावक को प्रभावित कर पाने की कविता का दुर्लभ होना भी इस उदासीन भावभूमि को जन्म देता रहा होगा। सन 1999 से पेरिस में यूनेस्को द्वारा तय किया गया 21 मार्च का विश्व कविता दिवस पर्याप्त नहीं। वैसे वह भी किसे याद है? रोज एक कविता की या ऐसी अनेक वेबसाइट्स भी पर्याप्त नहीं। रोज रोज अनेक सरकारी झोली के पुरस्कार तो पता नहीं अच्छा करते हैं या बुरा, क्योंकि ऐसी स्पर्धात्मक मनस्थितियां धैर्य वाली शालीन कविता का सर्जन कैसे करने देंगी? कोई कला कौशल का पारखी अकबर आए, एक बड़े पुरस्कार के लिए कवियों से आवेदन पत्र मंगवाए और पुरस्कार सभी को देकर उन्हें नवरत्नों से बाहर रखे। भला पुरस्कार के लिए कोई निराला आवेदन करेगा क्या? बात व्यवहारिक न सही, संजीदा कवि की खोज खबर की है। कुछ तो करना पड़ेगा। साहित्य अकादमी सोचने का मौका देती है, यह भी एक अच्छा उपाय है। कुछ ही समय पहले साहित्य अकादमी ने राइटर इन रेसिडेंसी स्कीम में रचनाकारों को बिना शर्त के कहीं बाहर जाकर 6 महीने तक मनपसंद फुर्सत में रचना करने का एक मौका दिया था। यह अपने आप में अद्भुत उपाय था। यद्यपि कुछ सयाने लोग यहाँ भी अपना सयानापन छोड़ नहीं सके। अच्छे उपाय के लिए ऐसी कुछ कीमत तो चुकानी पड़ती है, पर ऐसे उपाय 2-4 शालीन रचनाओं का सर्जन करे तो भी बहुत सार्थक है। गोवा में कविता का मैराथन या अमरावती पोएटिक प्रिज्म में 32 देशों की 40 भाषाओं के 160 कवियों का शामिल होना, या ऐसे और भी अनेक प्रयत्न कुछ अधिक सार्थक रूप से जरूर माहौल बनाते रहेंगे। पर हमारा देश इतना बड़ा है कि बहुत बड़ा है। बड़े लिटरेचर फेस्टिवल समृद्ध कवियों तक सीमित और सुलभ होते हैं, यह दुर्भाग्य भी झेलना पड़ता है। यहाँ कुछ सुझाव नहीं देने, उसकी गुंजाइश नहीं। सिर्फ शालीन रचनाओं और रचनाकारों की खोज खबर की फिक्र का तकाजा है। शायद दिशाएं और दृष्टियां परिष्कृत हों और प्रकाशित हों, इसके प्रति हमारा अंगुली निर्देश करने का एक प्रयास है। हिंदी साहित्य के इतिहास में यह एक शब्द प्रयुक्त हुआ था कि आधुनिक युग गद्य का युग है। यह भी बताता है कि कविता के प्रति आज हमारी उदासीनता सब जगह दिखाई देती है। तो यह तो मानने का मन करता है कि कविता का अंत हो रहा है, या तो संजीदा कवि और भावक दोनों का दुर्लभ होना ही कविता का अंत बताता है। पर अभी किसी न किसी प्रकार की संजीवनी की आशा का समय बीत नहीं गया। सब कुछ हर किसी के लिए तो नहीं होता। कविता कला के लिए दुनिया में जगह बनाए रखना ही हमारा लक्ष्य है। यह नहीं भूलना है कि शालीन कविता की शक्ति कम नहीं हुई है। बस शोर कोलाहल में से उसे उबारना, धैर्य पेशेंस के साथ उसे सही स्थान पर सादर आसीन करना और निरंतर उनकी खोज खबर लेते रहना तथा आधुनिक डिजिटल सिस्टम्स को अपनाते हुए आवश्यक उपाय करते रहना ही जरूरी है। नहीं तो शायद एक दिन कविता हमारे हाथों से खिसक जाएगी। यूं कविता को बचाने का काम स्वयं कविता ही करेगी। उसे संजीवनी बनने देना है, यह मेरा और आपका कार्य रहेगा। कुछ तो अभी यहाँ हो भी रहा है और कुछ लोग बेहतर प्रयास कर भी रहे हैं, पर कोलाहल करने वालों के कारण यह सब काफ़ी नहीं है। ऐसे अच्छे प्रयासों में classicalpoets.org, द पोएट्री सोसाइटी इंडिया, कविताकोश.org, रेखता.org, CCVA के अंतर्राष्ट्रीय कवि सम्मेलन, ऐसा बहुत कुछ हो रहा है, पर काफ़ी नहीं है। जोर का धक्का जोर से लगाने की जरूरत है, जिससे भावक काव्य पुस्तक पढ़ें, सिर्फ पूरी नहीं करें। कुछ लोग पुस्तक पढ़ते हैं, कुछ पूरी करते हैं। कविता के प्रति रुचि को परिष्कृत करना, रुचि को बढ़ाना, यही हमारी कविता के क्राइसिस का उपाय मुझे दिखाई देता है। शुक्रिया।
Thank you, Mr. Namdev Tarachandani. You had addressed the basics of the situation. That is, if poetry is dead, you have also diagnosed the situation and suggested possible remedies. You believe that there should be a concerted effort to maintain a space for poetry, as well as maintain the atmosphere and the ambience of poetry. That can be possible only when the poets change by not degenerating into technicalities or to mere entertainment. And those who respond, or the listeners, should also change by equipping themselves to learn to receive the soul of poetry. So that's an interesting take. Thank you so much. I believe we have come to the end of the lectures.
Yeah. Well, we will end this session here. Finally, I thank the chair, Professor Pradip Acharya-ji, and the participants, Dr. Pranjit, Borah-ji, Dr. Darshini Dadawala-ji, Dr. Premchand Singh-ji, and Sri Namdev Tarachandani-ji. Our next third session will commence at 4:30, which will be meant for poetry recitations, and Saraswati Samman winner, Sindhi poet, Sri Vasdev Mohiji will chair that session. Let us look forward to poetry recitation session. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.